Welcome to another episode of What's Working in E-commerce. I'm your host, Egan Heath, the owner of Caravan Digital, a digital marketing agency for direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands. And today on What's Working in E-commerce, we're speaking about business intelligence for e-commerce brands. I have Maximilian Rast from Klar, all the way from Germany. Max, thank you for joining us.
Hi again, great to be here. Hi.
Right on. Tell us a little bit about what is business intelligence for anyone who's not familiar, and how does it, how should e-commerce owners and marketers be thinking about business intelligence?
Pretty broad question, but essentially, business intelligence really comes down to bringing together all the data that's really created at various points within the company, pulling it together in one place, and presenting it in a way that is meaningful and helps the companies understand, how they're doing and where they might have areas to improve.
Okay, yeah. What's an example of some of that data you're pulling together? Can you kind of, give an example of maybe even when you got started in this, what kind of BI work were you doing, or, the sorts of things that Klar does now?
Look, it really depends upon the stage of the company you're in. When you're very early, you probably just want to have some controlling dashboards to kind of understand how much are you earning, how much are you spending. You probably want to keep a close eye on your profit and loss, just to make sure that you're actually staying afloat. Whereas the data work at that stage is going to be primarily qualitative, so actually just speaking to people, because you're still trying to really understand on a very one-to-one level what is working and what isn't. And then obviously as you start to grow, you can't really, it's not really scalable to keep that one-to-one connection to your people. So you now try to, now that you've grown, you try to leverage larger sets of data in order to, understand the behavior from your customers based on, what you're seeing in those data points. And maybe then you go in and validate those quantitative points by talking to people. So especially later on, once you have more data, you try to find those trends and insights in numbers instead of just by talking to people.
Okay, so I'm very interested in this, not quantitative but qualitative feedback. What sorts of things have you seen work with that? Is that polls? Is that customer surveys? Interviews? What kind of things have you seen in that space, maybe early on for an e-commerce company?
So, polls and surveys are probably always the easiest to implement. If you have some customers you can send emails to. I usually, though, actually like to talk to people directly. In my last CMO position I took on before starting Klar, I literally just sat down 1 or 2 hours every week and started calling people and just asked them questions. And, 4 out of 5 told me to, leave them alone. And then the 5th person took some time and gave me some insights. And I usually like to work, from more qualitative to more quantitative. So I talk to people to form initial hypothesis of what I think might be going on. Then I try to find those hypotheses within the data to see, hey, can I actually see this somewhere? And then I try to go the in-between step, and then I would go with something like a survey, where it's still qualitative, but on a larger scale, to sort of see, hey, did I not just speak to, a few outliers, but do these people I actually spoke to and that informed my hypothesis of what can be done actually be validated qualitatively in a larger set.
Were there some questions you asked that really dug out some jewels? Like, I'm very curious. I've heard that sometimes the wording really matters, and what you're asking, customers or clients really matters. Were there some that really got you some great insights?
So it really depends on what type of person you speak to and what you're trying to understand, right? So I think there's various different things. Do you speak to someone who recently purchased, and the interesting question there usually is now, what almost stopped you from purchasing? Because usually the very interesting segment of people you would want to understand is those that didn't buy, but getting a hold of them is very difficult because you don't have any contact information. So you can get in touch with people who just purchased, and then by asking what almost stopped you from purchasing, you can try to understand what might be going on with those people who actually didn't purchase. So that's usually a good question to ask. And then also with recent first-time customers is like, she just like, why did you buy this? What is like, what are you trying to accomplish on a, maybe not ask it directly that way, but on a functional or emotional level? What are you hoping for our product does for you, right? What kind of mindset is my product arriving at your door? And is my product actually able to deliver on that expectation?
Yeah. One of the ones I've heard, we like copy hackers for, direct to consumer, copywriting. And one of the ones they recommend is what was going on in your life when you purchased this product. So even kind of get the broader context of what, the what and the why, rather than just the why of you may even get more context around that. So we like that one.
Yeah. Another good one to also understand how your product resonates is, how disappointed would you be if you could no longer use our product? Be like,
can you live without it?
Yeah, so that's kind of like, especially when you're early on, you're still trying to understand if you're actually onto something. That's usually a very good question to, understand how close is your product meeting your customers' needs and demands and wants.
Pretty interesting. And I may have even undersold you on the intro here. I see that, if I'm reading this right, if you've helped 100 direct-to-consumer brands generate more than $100 million in sales. Is that right?
That's probably a bit of an overstatement, but we do work with hundreds of brands that not all yet doing 100 million. We do have a few.
Right, but maybe in aggregate, that's awesome.
No, so like I think altogether it's well over that. We have a few brands on their own who are doing well over 100 million who we're working with. Also, in my previous role, before starting Klar, was CMO of a brand doing over 100 mil themselves.
Yeah. So you've seen this side. You've seen what it takes to grow to this size. Can you kind of lay out that path for us? A lot of people, listening to or watching this are going to be much earlier in the process of maybe 7 figures, maybe sub 7 figures, maybe in that range. What are the steps? How do you get to that size? What does it take?
I mean, it's always one of those terms I don't really like because it's a bit vague and ambiguous. But it's like, it starts really with product market fit, which is also what I was talking about before. And it's a step that's usually skipped quite a bit. People have an idea, they develop a product, and then they immediately go really into the scaling phase and try to, run paid ads and try to get customers and acquire them. And in most cases, really, the product is not really ready for it. Obviously there are exceptions to every rule, but I would say 8 or 9 out of 10 products are not ready to scale in their first iteration. You really need to spend some time and get the product as well as the product experience right for a specific type of customer, right? And then also find a way to communicate to that customer in a way that resonates. And I think getting that right for one audience is like really the first step you really have to do. Then from there, the second is then finding a first channel that really works for you. Usually most brands get their initial spike of growth from like a single channel. So you don't need 5 things to get big. Really, one channel, if it's a sufficiently large enough channel, can carry you quite a long way. And then once you have that figured out, you can probably get with that easily into the 8 figures. And then to get to 9 figures, it's really about replicating this, right? So it could be either by adding additional channels, it could be by having additional products, or it could be by selling the same product to a different audience in a different way. So you layer on almost like a second type of business on the existing business in a way. And that's kind of how you can really grow. And then obviously, the base foundation of all of that is actually managing your unit economics and your cash position. So if you need to be, have your business fundamentals right and straight. Otherwise, if you not make enough money to cover your costs and don't manage your cash well enough, this all the other stuff can be as great as you want. You're not going to get there.
Yeah, that's a helpful overview. Thank you. I'm curious on that unit economics piece. What's required really there to grow? What do you see? As someone who's been a CMO to successful brands.
So it really depends a bit on the AOV also that you have. So I'm not totally familiar with the logistics cost structure you might have in the US, but now speaking specifically for German brands. So I think if you're going below 30 euros in AOV, it's too low. And then you want to have, depending on how high your AOV is, if you're on the lower end, you probably want to have like 15 to at most 25% product costs of net revenue. And then if you go into like the 100, 200 euros, you probably can bring that up to around 50% product costs. And then you want to spend, again, probably on the lower AOV side, at most 15, maybe 20% of your net revenue on logistics and transaction costs. And then obviously on the higher AOV side, you probably go closer to like 5 to 10%, so that you end up with a contribution margin too. So net revenue minus product cost, logistics cost, and transaction costs of anywhere with like 70 to 40%. And then you spend your marketing on there, which on the lower AOV side is probably going to be quite a bit higher in like the 30% range. And on the higher AOV side, probably shooting for like 15 to 20%.
Yeah, those are great benchmarks. Thank you. One thing that's been interesting or just challenging with some maybe smaller clients is, right, like you're saying about average order value, AOV, if that's south of $50, that's very challenging to make work with paid right now. And then you may have answered this in what you were saying, but just so I understand, one thing that comes up with our clients is in some cases they're fulfilling themselves and things like that. And the question sort of becomes of, okay, how do I think about my marketing cost and my return on marketing, just on we'll call it a gross basis or whatever, of just unit economics of those products. But then how do I also think about all my net costs, like the warehouse and the team and everything like that? Do you have any advice around that, again, for smaller brands that are well under, 8 figures?
I mean, it's really, really difficult to give you one answer for everything because it really depends upon, how aggressively you want to grow. What are your targets? Is your product a product that is currently also being repeat purchased quite a lot? So it's a really multifaceted question. Like I mentioned initially, managing your cash situation, having transparency on your cash is super, super crucial, especially if you're not like majorly venture backed or funded in any way, because you can very easily, outspend. The thing is though, like if the return ad spend ROAS metric is like always, hey, it goes on your revenue figures, usually even on your gross revenue figures, and doesn't really consider that you have all those costs layered on. So you really should spend some time, at least initially once. Ideally, you have it on an ongoing basis, which something like tool like Klar could give you, but really understand your unique economics, right? And understand your fixed costs, and based off that, really set a target for your overall return on ad spend that you need to achieve in order to actually, at least break even, or even better, make a profit, right? So ideally, you want to have that on an ongoing basis, and if not, just do that deep dive once and check in every other month to see if there's any major changes on those cost structure sides to make sure that you're not running campaigns that might look great on the surface, but actually lead to you burning money every day.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like ROAS is not enough. We really need some form of ROI. Like, are our ads profitable on a net basis, or at least break even?
Yeah. And there's obviously reasons why you wouldn't want that to be. So, the business I've been at before, like YFood, they're very loyal customers, repeating quite heavily, probably the biggest subscription program in any D2C brand in the German market. So we had like massive LTV, right? So we were able to spend more than we were making on a first on a first order basis, but then could recoup our initial investment extremely quickly because the product was great. People came back, and so we were able to spend more to acquire more people. But that's also a decision you need to make consciously. And we were venture backed, so we did have some funding overall because making that change to pre-invest in your customers is not just going to impact your acquisition cost target. It's also going to impact your overall cash flow position quite heavily.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. A lot of people who are bootstrapping their own e-commerce brands, this is going to look very different than if you've got venture capital. So thank you for bringing that up. I have a note here to ask you. I think this is a good time about, customer acquisition cost, customer lifetime value, and how are those more about liquidity than profitability?
Yeah. So, I mean, the question is always like, one of the question people talk about is like, what is the right life or the CLV to CAC ratio? What should my lifetime value be relative to my customer acquisition costs? And I actually spent quite a bit of time looking into that and like playing around with the model, trying to understand where do you have to be. And it's always really a question about what's the one thing, like most questions, like what time horizon do you optimize for? You're looking for maximum return in like 6 months from now or in like 6 years from now. That's already like a big impact on the question. But if you then also decide that you want to pre-invest in your customers, like I just said, what usually happens if you're now only breaking even after 3 months, you have 3 months of investment that you don't recoup immediately, right? So you're making a loss for the first 3 months. So if I now acquire, a customer for $50, but I only make a contribution margin of $30 in the first month of the first order, I have a loss of 20, obviously. Now, if I multiply that with 10,000 customers, all of a sudden I have a loss not of, 200K, And now I do that for every single month. And after like half a year, I've made a loss of around $1 million. And I need to have that in the bank. Otherwise, I'm going to be in problem. So just managing this whole, what is the right CLV to CAC ratio is really a question of also, what is your overall cash position and how aggressively can you pre-invest in customers without running into problems there.
That's really the trick in e-commerce. Yeah, I love that you're saying this benchmark or this ratio of its customer lifetime value over your customer acquisition cost. Are there some benchmarks you've seen in that? Is there a range where you really like to see that when you're working with a brand?
It really depends on what stage they're in, and what their goals are. But usually, what you find is like a range of 2 to 3. Maximizes growth, and it really depends then upon how aggressive do people want to get. Probably later on, you want to be closer to 3. Earlier on, if your cash position allows it, you want to be closer to 2, just to maximize growth as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. Is there a metric in there too of how long does it take to get that customer lifetime value? Is there a word for that?
Like you could call it, I will always call it like a CAC payback period, right? So that's like the break even point. How many days do you need for your lifetime value to reach or surpass your customer acquisition costs? And that's the day when you start making money.
Yeah, that's great. I know you went over this earlier, but just like I find contribution margin really tricky. So how do you, for other people who don't understand it, how do you explain it and how do you think about it if you can break that down for us? It comes up regularly and it's kind of this next level, CMO sort of metric that's not as easy to understand as ROAS.
Yeah, I mean, so it's actually for me, it's like one of the first things I learned going into e-commerce. I had quite some good teachers in the early days. And what we always do, and we also built into our tool, and is like a 3-tiered contribution margin approach. And I actually recently spoke to the former CMO of Gymshark, and he also said like it's the same thing they implemented, just gives you so much more transparency of your overall unit economic structure. So what we usually do when you have your P&L, I always start on top with what I call gross merchandise value, which is the original selling price of all units that were sold. From that, then I deduct my discounts and my vouchers discount being, a crossed out price when something is on sale, and a voucher being like a coupon code you apply on checkout. That will then give me my gross revenue. From that, I deduct my returns and taxes, which gives me my net revenue, which is now my baseline, because my net revenue is actually the money I have in the bank, which is already different to the revenue you use for your ROAS, because ROAS is usually calculated on a gross revenue, which is already a problem. But then going into the contribution margins. So from net revenue, you would deduct your cost of goods sold, which is literally the production cost of the product that was sold. That would give you your contribution margin 1. From that, then you deduct your logistics costs and your transaction costs. So how much you pay for PayPal or Shopify payments. That would give you your contribution margin 2. And from that, you deduct your marketing costs, which would give you your contribution margin 3, or net profit. So basically your profit before any fixed costs are deducted. And now so it's basically structured as contribution margin 1, the margin excluding the cost for the product that you've actually sold, contribution margin 2 minus the cost that it took you to create and fulfill that order, and contribution margin 3 minus the marketing you had to spend to generate the demand for that order. And now customer lifetime value should always be based on the contribution margin 2, because the way it works in e-com usually is that the vast majority of your marketing costs are spent to acquire customers initially. But we already said contribution margin 2 is the cost you have to fulfill an order completely. So you usually on the second, third, and fourth order will have very small marketing costs. So your contribution margin 2 is basically the incremental margin you generate with also all the repeat orders, whereas the entire marketing cost is used to calculate the customer acquisition costs.
Yeah. So thank you for going through that. It sounds like the broader goal is how much profit did this marketing get us? Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you want to see how much money is left after all variable costs are accounted for, and is that enough to cover my fixed costs? That's really the question. But having this 3-tiered approach just gives you a lot more transparency of where you actually are losing money. And where do you have room to optimize, and also what numbers do you want to use for your lifetime value calculation?
That's great. Is this something that your tool Klar helps with?
Yep. So that's actually one of the base foundations. So what we want to do is bring the acquisition side, retention side, and financial side of the data all together into one place, right? So we do have exactly this outlined P&L structure, fully integrated into every single report, so that you don't just optimize for revenue, but always profits.
That's great. And it sounds like you're pulling data. It could be from Shopify or the shopping cart platform, potentially, I don't know, from Klaviyo or email, but it sounds like really we're looking at the financials, if that's QuickBooks or whatever people are running their financials out of. It's putting that all together. So you're stitching that data together and getting actionable insights. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's your Shopify, it's your Klaviyo, Facebook, Google, TikTok ads, Google Analytics. We actually don't integrate with any accounting software. We don't need to right now. Obviously, it's something we could think about adding in the future. And because you still need your accounting, right? It's not something we're going to replace your financial statements, but we want to make also the financial data so accurate in the tool that you can basically make all your daily decisions on it. So you basically don't rely on your accounting for decision making. You still need it basically for legal reasons, but you can make all the decision making from within Klar.
That sounds awesome. That's something I've certainly run into in business myself, even as an agency owner, where it's sort of like accounting that might be for taxes and compliance, but at some level you need a chief financial officer hat on, and it sounds like a chief marketing officer needs to be looking at this as well. And you may need that data in real time, or much faster intervals.
I usually find that the very best marketers on the D2C side have also a very good understanding of their financials. I always you just obviously don't need to know all the accounting and tax stuff, but you just need to understand, hey, how much money do I actually make, and how much can I really invest in acquiring new customers, and just understanding that on a very intuitive level or basis so that you can make the right decisions and adjustments on a daily basis, I think is super crucial.
Yeah, it sounds like you're gathering that almost actionable P&L right out of Shopify or right out of their cart. Of we've got the revenue in there, we've got the costs in there. Does your customer then input their costs, or how does that part work?
Yeah, so we do have we do pull stuff from where it's available, but you can usually like you usually have the problem with some small medium enterprises. Their data is not well maintained, so you need to find and provide options for them to clean up the mess in a very easy way. So that's something that we also pay quite a lot of or invest quite a lot of energy into cleaning up messy data from the past, enriching it with what actually happened so that you can get to a very clean and clear reality of your data.
That's great. One thing I neglected to ask you about is you're talking about those 3 tiers of contribution margin. Is shipping pulled out at some point there? If you're charging customers for shipping and then you have to pay shipping, where does that one get subtracted?
So yeah, it's actually not subtracted. It's added in. So because it's a revenue source. So I put that in after. So actually in the very first deduction step. So from GMV minus discounts minus vouchers plus shipping revenue actually gives me your gross revenue.
Okay, gross revenue counts shipping, and then at some point the cost of shipping is subtracted out too.
Exactly. So from contribution margin 1 to 2, you would subtract logistics, which is the fulfillment cost and everything connected to it, plus the transaction costs. So that's when the costs get out. Some people have spoken to other people who are also working for big companies. They don't capture it as revenue. They would just, when you deduct logistics costs out, you also add the shipping revenue in to kind of like reduce the reduction a little bit. There's certainly an argument for that, but I usually would also see it as revenue because that's what it actually is.
All right. Max, you've generously offered to pull up some visuals to help us understand contribution margin. Can you kind of show us what we're looking at here and how we can think about this?
Sure. Happy to. I mean, this is from our tool, and we have like this full P&L structure integrated in, the entire reporting bottom up. And what you usually would do if you really would want to understand your margin structure is have a P&L that looks something like this. So you would start on the top here with your gross merchandise value, which is the original selling price of all the products you have sold. From that, you deduct your discounts and your vouchers. Discounts being like, a sale price, whereas vouchers being like a coupon code that is applied as checkout. And those are being shown here as a percentage of your, total GMV. Then you add your shipping revenue, so the amount of money people pay you if they are not reaching your minimum order threshold for free shipping. Some of that will give me your gross revenue. From that, you deduct your returns and taxes, which gives me your net revenue, which is essentially the money you actually have left. You're actually able to use to cover some costs. From that, then looking at the contribution margin, you have a 3-tiered approach, which gives you a lot more transparency on your margin structure and where these costs actually occur. So in the first step, you can see here, I deduct my cost of goods sold. So the material cost that it takes to produce the product and send it into my warehouse. In this case here, it's 26,000, which is 23% of net revenue. So I'm left with a contribution margin of 89K, which is equivalent to a contribution margin 1 of 77%. And the next step now, we deduct your logistics costs and the transaction costs, which are basically the costs you have in order to fulfill the order to the customer, right? So here it's 15% for logistics and 2.5% for transaction, which leaves me with 67K or a contribution margin 2 of 58%. And now finally, we have quite high marketing costs here. We deduct 62K in marketing, which leaves us with a small profit of 5% or 5.5K. And now this gives me quite a bit of transparency. I can see where my costs occur and also how much money I'm actually left with at the end of the day to cover my costs. And that's already great to see, it gives you more transparency, but it becomes more powerful now, for example, going here into this flex table where you can now even on a product basis, look at every single product and see the same structure on a product level. So going from GMV to gross revenue, over to net revenue, down to contribution margin 2, you can see actually how much money you're making. You can also go on a shipping country level, marketing channel level, like really calendar month level, a bunch of different levels you can go into and really slice and dice at your P&L and see when and where you're actually making money. Plus, we also have this whole thing integrated on the retention side of the business. So I can go into like a cohort reporting here. You can see, okay, in January 2020, I acquired 500 new customers. I had a blended customer acquisition cost for these customers of 50 euros, right? But now I'm here on a contribution margin 2 level. So I can see in month 0, so in January, I generated 23 euros in margin from these customers. That then went up in +1. So in February to 32, in March to 42, in April to 48, and then in May to 53 euros. So I'm basically reaching break even on these customers here in month 4 and starting to make a profit, right? And yeah, that's kind of contribution margins, how you can use them and how we have them integrated into Klar across the board.
Awesome demo and very cool tool. Thank you so much for showing that, Max.
Sure, 100%.
Max, thank you so much for sharing all this about how, a sophisticated CMO thinks for a brand that's grown to 9 figures. Tell us a little bit about, who's a good fit for Klar and, where can people find it and learn more?
Yeah, so our website is getklar.com. So getklar.com. And who's a good fit? I mean, really any type of e-commerce brands that want to understand the data better. We usually work with clients. The majority of our clients is like in the, say, 3 to 20 million range. We do support brands also quite a bit later. The question there usually is, do they already have a sophisticated BI setup or team in place? If they do, there's usually less of a willingness to replace it with a just software that does it all for them. But yeah, that's kind of who we're going after right now. Shopify brands only, but we're adding some additional shop systems actually starting right now. So even if you're not on Shopify or even have something custom, which we will enable in the future, just please reach out and happy to have a chat and show you a little bit more.
All right, thanks. Is WooCommerce on the list in the future?
Also on the list, yeah. I mean, there's so WooCommerce is on the list, and there's Magento, obviously. Then there's some European, more regional things that are big in either the DACH market or the Nordics market on the list. So, but open to reprioritize if there's enough interest.
All right. Thanks so much. Well, folks, if you're a listener watching and you don't know these numbers, check out getklar.com. And Max, thank you so much for coming on and sharing what's working in e-commerce.
Thank you again. Thank you.